Hi, my name is Bruce Bolger, and I'm founder of the Enterprise Engagement Alliance. And we are dedicated to promoting the practices of capitalism that enhance returns for investors only by creating value for customers, employees, distribution and supply chain partners, and communities. And we're very lucky today to have Stefan Padfield. He's executive director of the Free Enterprise Project of the National Center for Public Policy Research. And you might wonder, why are we having Stefan on this show? Because, in fact, his organization has filed some cases against ESG and DEI. But on the other hand, this is an organization that is nonpartisan, to my knowledge, secular, and that promotes free enterprise. And Stefan has written some interesting work about stakeholder capitalism that I think it's important to share. So my slide here got a little screwed up because of a last minute change, but he is executive director of the Free Enterprise Project of the National Center for Public Policy Research. And I'm now going to jump over to quickly one little quick advertisement. And you know what? I'm not going to. I'm now going to stop my share and get right to work. Stefan, thank you so much for joining us. And as you know, Stefan, the reason I reached out to you is because you wrote a really interesting paper in the National Law Journal, I believe, of Kentucky in 2022, which, even though it was largely against stakeholder capitalism, I frankly agreed with it, most of it. It sounds hard to believe because Stefan was one of the very few people writing about the subject at that time who decided to do a little research. And what his research told him is that there wasn't, and Stefan, you're going to have a chance to tell me if I'm wrong, but what I read in his excellent report was that there really isn't a clear definition of stakeholder capitalism. And he actually found about four of them. And three of them, I pretty much agree, were being thrown about, but I thought they were all based on press releases and had nothing to do with reality. They were virtue signaling and greenwashing and everything that I think most people would disagree about stakeholder capitalism. But Stefan, you found another definition of stakeholder capitalism, which you actually said you thought that might be okay, but you didn't dwell on it much because it's okay. And it's funny because Lucien Bebchuk, who you may know or know of, he's a professor of law at Harvard Law School, and he was a major opponent to stakeholder capitalism, but he never bothered to define it. And I asked him about it. Where did you get this definition? And he said it was the Business Roundtable. Well, it was a press release. So, Stefan, how did you stumble upon a logical definition of stakeholder capitalism, one that you think is consistent with free enterprise, if I'm correct? And could you tell us a little about that? But first, tell us about your organization.
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. It's great to be here. Always interested to have conversations about these types of issues. And as you mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Free Enterprise Project, which is part of the National Center for Public Policy Research. The National Center, which any of your viewers can find at nationalcenter.org,
Mhm.
has been around since basically the 1980s, and it has a number of projects, the Free Enterprise Project just being one of them. We also have Project 21, which is essentially a very large group of Black conservatives who give voice to a perspective that is usually not amplified by mainstream media, which is that of the Black conservative. We have Able Americans, which focuses on disability issues from a conservative, right of center, free market perspective. We also have a project that is geared specifically towards climate change and issues around ESG, focusing on the sustainability and climate change issues. And then we have the Free Enterprise Project, which I am, as I mentioned, the executive director of. And we've been around basically since 2007, essentially. Got started when corporations seemed to lurch to the left. I think that whole movement, one can debate about what the genesis was and what the drivers were, but it seems like the pinpoints of the 2008 crash, where we had Occupy Wall Street, and
Yeah.
essentially, I think a lot of businesses, CEOs, corporate governance types concluded that the way, as someone once put it, to keep the pitchforks at bay is to cut a deal with the radicals, right? And essentially, the deal was, we'll start pushing some of your leftist activist agenda if you don't come after us as the corporate, sort of CEO suite individuals. And that's a story that's been told by a number of different people, and I think there's something to that. And then the second big driver was the Black Lives Matter movement with George Floyd and the riots and everything that came with that, where the corporations basically, many of them, most of them, really went all in on this anti-racist agenda, which, from our perspective, and I think the perspective of many others, is essentially, it's a neo-racist quota system. It's contrary to merit. It's contrary to individual worth. So that's some of the work we do, or some of the issues that we focus on. And the work that we do is primarily done through shareholder proposals. So we are shareholders in a number of companies. We file proposals. Our goal is to get those companies back to neutral, to move them back towards neutral. We always use a shareholder wealth maximization yardstick for anything that we do. And we also do other things. You mentioned lawsuits, I think, in our conversation before we kicked off. We do that. We will occasionally file lawsuits. We've sued the SEC successfully, and we've had other litigation actions. And then we have just engagement, letters to the board. We do op-eds. We write white papers. So it's basically, we are a think tank, or, as our founder likes to say, a action tank. We are active, and we try to get corporations back to neutral, and back to the business of doing business. And I think you and I would probably agree, just from the few interactions we've had, via email, on a lot of that, right? In terms of my own journey to focusing on stakeholder capitalism, certainly came at it from a position of concern, right? Which is, as you mentioned, I took a look at the ways in which stakeholder capitalism, the phrase, the terminology, the perspective, could be abused, right, in a way that undermines capitalism and undermines shareholder value. And in the course of sort of untangling those different perspectives, I also did note, for the record, that I do think there is a perspective that is, what I would say, pro-shareholder value, pro-capitalist, which is essentially that if all you're saying is, look, the current, or maybe the more recently past, approach to capitalism, to shareholder wealth maximization, has been too narrow, and we want to expand the informational inputs to make the decision making more fully informed, right? But not changing the ultimate yardstick, which is shareholder wealth maximization, from my perspective, that's a vision that I can get on board with. Now, the problem with all of that, and why I still do not use stakeholder capitalism in a way other than to criticize it, is, for the most part, that is such a small slice of what I see actually being done in the name of stakeholder capitalism. And essentially everything else has been weaponized and taken over to advance radical leftist agendas. So even though we can debate about what it should be, I think in practice it has been weaponized as an ideologically political agenda.
Well, you're absolutely right. And by the way, I couldn't disagree. By the way, we are a nonpartisan. We're neither right nor left. Personally, I agree with things on the right, and things I agree with on the left. I'm a New Yorker. What do you expect?
Mm.
So, and we are definitely nonpartisan. The party system, in my view, is destroying this country, as our forefathers predicted it would. George Washington warned us against the party system, and we ignored him. So, but getting back to what your point, Stefan, here's why I know you're right about what we've learned about the CEOs in this country is that they are very driven by their corporate communications departments and their speechwriters. So when the corporate crash came around in 2008, all we saw was the corporate communications departments getting to work, trying to paint a pretty picture about it, right? And it was nothing but hypocrisy. We all know it. Same with George Floyd. I lived it. I saw it. It was nothing. 90% of it was virtue signaling, greenwashing, and stupid. And most African Americans that I know thought it was stupid. So we can even have, well, I think we'll have time to discuss why it was stupid. But on the other hand, what is not stupid is to have a diverse workforce. If the country is 50% black, then you want to have, it isn't, it's 15%, but if it's 45% brown, there are business reasons only business reasons why you want to have the broadest possible market of customers, employees, and talent. But how do you go about doing that? Great question. You don't do it by discriminating. And likewise with ESG. We don't know whether there's global warming, do we, Stefan? Do we really, Stefan? Do we really know? But we do know that that right now I have a 26 acres of a fund of a Superfund site on the Hudson River, 2 miles from where I live, that will never be cannot be lived in for another 10 years. And then you know who's paying for it? Today's BP shareholders, when the damage was done 60 years ago. So, Stefan, I agree with you. The whole argument has to be on value creation. How are we creating value for the shareholders? And so I'm going to get to that. So the stakeholder capitalism, that was the other thing that you are absolutely right. Not the, when the Business Roundtable created that statement that created all this mess, we all know it was virtue signaling. It was a corporate communications effort in response to George Floyd. There were no standards, no metrics, and it was nothing, in my view, but greenwashing and virtue signaling. And it set back stakeholder capitalism by 5 years because it created the confusion you noted. And when I mentioned this to a member of the Heritage Foundation, that where did you guys get this definition from? There's no basis for it. He said, well, you might be right, but it's too late. We've already messed up the definition. He pretty much said, we've already confused the whole world, so give up. But he's wrong. I didn't give up because here's the answer to your question I'd like to ask you about this. Stakeholder capitalism comes from R. Edward Deming, pardon me, from a gentleman named Edward Deming, a management consultant and an expert in total quality management, which is all about aligning the interests of all your stakeholders toward a common purpose, harmonizing the interests. And this is coming to a question because I do want to hear more from you than me. And then the second thing is it's a guy named Peter Drucker. We've got to focus on the customer. And the only way, that's how we're going to make money for the shareholders. So, my question to shareholder capitalists, how can you maximize value for customers, for your shareholders, if you don't harmonize the interests of your stakeholders? If your employees aren't motivated, if your customers aren't motivated, if your supply chain and distribution partners aren't motivated, if your communities hate you and you're polluting so much, you're creating all sorts of risks for future shareholders, how is that good for capitalism?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think the distinction is that those of us that essentially defend capitalism without any additional qualifier argue that that's already baked into capitalism, right? So you said you've run a number of businesses. I think the most common form of a capitalist naturally, without any adding stakeholder onto the word, just looks at all those issues you raised in connection with trying to maximize the profit of the business, right? So it would be a very bad business person to not be concerned about customers, to not be concerned about employees, to not be concerned about the community and all the things you mentioned, right? So the issue becomes, okay, do we promote the idea of capitalism, right? Full stop, that understands, recognizes, and basically publicizes this view of the capitalist, right? That it's that you're going to naturally take all these things into consideration, or do we give in to the temptation that says, well, you know, capitalism's got a bad rap. There certainly have been some bad actors who have, in the name of short-term profit maximization, right, committed fraud and, broken environmental regulations to pollute and so on. So do we tweak the message, right? Do we come at the public, for example, with something else? And so the use of stakeholder capitalism as that something else, I think has some legs behind it, right? It can potentially shift the perspective. I'll give you a perfect example, at least in my mind. So right around that Business Roundtable letter, and sort of in the few years immediately following that, there was a particular law firm, very well known, does a lot of corporate defense work. And I actually found myself just randomly at a conference, sitting at a table, just me and the primary partner who's been, sort of heading up this project. And he was very honest about the fact that to him, the choice was not capitalism as we've always understood it, or a new thing called stakeholder capitalism. The choice to him was either you're going to lean into this thing that we're now calling stakeholder capitalism, or you're going to get communism, right? That's the way that he saw the choice. He viewed the pressures coming from the populist movements, excuse me, um, from the regulators, right, with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And he basically viewed that as the choice. So he was all on board because he didn't think there was an option of just continuing to defend capitalism as it's been commonly understood. I, on the other hand, think that all the sort of devils that you unleash by opening the door to let every group claim that they get the priority under the banner of stakeholder capitalism, I think the costs of that so far outweigh whatever benefits you're claiming that I want to just defend capitalism, quote unquote capitalism, without any qualifier.
Well, and that's a great point, but here's the challenge I have for you. Um, the fact of the matter is, shareholder capitalism is not efficient. It's not. It's a joke. The amount of waste that I see in my clients and my business is staggering. They don't even measure human capital. Their human capital doesn't exist on a balance sheet. It's not even there. It's all buried under goodwill. So a company can abuse employees, have 70% turnover, have a massive inefficiency. And Stefan, I'm older than you perhaps, but I remember the total quality management. I was movement. I was very young. It was the 1980s. And what American companies were doing, they weren't measuring defects. They just piled them up in the back. Just piled them up. There'd be great big piles of defects of quality products. So the Japanese came along and they listened to a guy named Edward Deming, who's a compatriot of yours. I believe you're of German descent. Well, actually, Edward Deming is of German descent. And he came up with this idea of total quality management. Now, there's a very big difference, Stefan, between harmonizing interests and balancing interests. And I would say that the reason shareholder capitalism is so inefficient is that they're balancing interest. They're paying, oh, we got to pay the employees now because there might be a strike. Everything is ad hoc when it comes to employees. There's no metrics. Turnover is never reported. Do you know there's something called human capital ROI? It's a simple calculation that is proven to be predictive of future equity value creation. There's an organization called Irrational Capital, developed by a guy named, and researched by a guy named Dan Ariely from Fuqua at Duke, that's been proven by JP Morgan 6 years in a row to be predictive of future equity value creation, such that the one ETF that's based on it has outperformed the S&P 500 by 4% every year, which not one. I don't think there's one hedge fund that's done that 6 years in a row. So my argument with you, Stefan, is that it's not taught in people management is not taught in school. B, you do not get it anywhere except maybe Darden. So we brought up a whole lot of CEOs who have no knowledge of how people actually create wealth within their organ. None. They're not trained in it. They have no knowledge. So they do all these ad hoc things and they don't have. So I'm going to argue with you that shareholder capitalism is really very inefficient because it doesn't harmonize the interests of people. Give you a great final example, CSX Railroad. They hired a new CEO who was a stakeholder capitalist. He was fired within 3 years because the shareholders couldn't give a damn about the employees. They could care less. That's, as you know, you're not going to make much money in the railroad industry unless there's a big sale, right? So the stockholders wanted the company sold. So they fired the stakeholder capitalist, and now the company is, everything he built is crumbling. So my question to you, Stefan, is shareholder capitalism really efficient? Honestly, look at all the waste. Look at all the companies that do less than the S&P 500. Is it efficient?
Yeah, I mean, the phrase that comes to mind, if I can sort of tweak a well-known one, is I think capitalism is the least worst system, except for all the others that have been tried, right? And I would say that about shareholder wealth maximization. I mean, I guess there's a lot to unpack in what you said, right? And I do think
Go
it's
for it.
worth noting that in these sorts of conversations, everybody's got their list of examples, right? It's sort of like there was a time when we thought doing quantitative analysis and empirical analysis was going to give us the answers we were looking for. And then fast forward 5 years, and what we've basically got now is the same debates, and everybody's just got their studies, right? So you've got your 20, I've got my 20, and in the end, we still got to make a decision. I
Yeah.
guess I just have a hard time understanding why a pure capitalist system with the North Star of share value, right? Profit, doesn't do all the things you want it to do if in fact they are as profitable as you say they are. And then the other point is simply, to the extent there are things, again, the externality conversation that comes up a lot, why don't we just rely on government regulation, external regulation, to align those interests and avoid those externalities to the extent that they're legitimate? Because again, the trade-off here is you can either tweak capitalism with a North Star of shareholder value, which will not be perfect in terms of some utopian outcome, but may still well be the best of all possible worlds in reality. And then the trade-off is, if we say, well, no, we're going to do something different because we don't think this thing is perfect, and so we're going to start bringing in these other metrics and these other perspectives, the way that can so quickly go off the rails. And you want to talk examples. I mean, Cracker Barrel, I guess Bud Light. I mean, the examples of where these companies, where their thinking was, oh, we're going to attract this other stakeholder. We're gonna sort of elicit more positive responses. We're going to harmonize our interests with these other groups of stakeholders, forgetting who their customer base is, forgetting that
Exactly.
the market is going to punish you, right, if you don't keep focused on profit.
Or
So I think
customer.
it's a two point.
There's a difference, isn't there?
Yeah, there's well, the customer, I think, because the yardstick for measuring how successful you are with customers, I think, needs to be the share price and the profit, right? That's sort of the metric that we can hold management accountable to, because once we start pivoting away from that, it just leaves the door open for the self-serving management. We have the agency problem that we're familiar with, right? So I hear what you're saying, and I think those are all very important points and certainly valid as far as they go. I just don't see them going far enough for me to jettison my defense of shareholder capitalism and embrace stakeholder capitalism with all the
Well,
downsides that I see.
and I'm not here to convince you of that. I honestly, not at all. Because I do agree with you. The term, if I were coming at it from your standpoint, I would probably steer clear of it too, because your audience isn't going to understand it. And you have to explain, wait a minute. No, don't you understand? Everybody got the definition wrong. They invented it. Basically, it was an enormous debate over a press release, as far as I'm concerned. None of these things that these companies, you know what stakeholder capitalists are? Costco's a stakeholder capitalist. Delta Airlines is a stakeholder capitalist. Wegmans is a stakeholder capitalist. Stu Leonard's here in New York are stakeholder capitalists. And what does that mean? It only means that they don't believe in making money by ripping people off. Did you know that 50% of advertising are lies? Is that good? And I don't believe, see, I'm a free enterprise guy. I'm a libertarian. Why do we always have to rely on government for everything? You mean to tell me that shareholder capitalism means go out, rip them off, lie in advertising? Verizon has the worst customer service. I'm sorry, it does. As a new CEO, maybe it'll get better. What? We're all supposed to just say that's great, that these companies have horrendous customer service, that they mistreat their employees, that they pollute? Forget about global warming, that they make the water down near me dangerous? So I would argue with this, Stefan, that I agree, don't name the name. In fact, you know what Lucien Bebchuk said to me? He said, Bruce, that's stakeholder capitalism. That's just better business, the way you define it. That's just better capitalism. But Stefan, here's my question. Over 50% of Americans don't like capitalism now. So why are we defending a term that we have destroyed by abusing the rights? Why are we as business people waiting for the government to stop us from ripping people off? Why don't we change the paradigm and say, don't rip people off?
Well, I mean, I think we already have rules against ripping people off, right? There's fraud, there's criminal laws, right? And there's also the competitive marketplace. If you're ripping
Ugh.
people off, then some other entity is going to come along, right?
Right,
And outcompete you for those
right.
customers that you're ripping off. So again, I don't know that we need stakeholder capitalism to address those issues, nor do I think leaning into stakeholder capitalism is going to make those issues go away. I think that's just a part of the messy human nature that we are all imbued with, right? That we're going to have cheats, we're going to have people who cut corners. And so the question is, what's the least worst system? Again, getting back to this sort of idea that I think
Capitalism.
is fundamentally grounding, right? And so the idea of do we need government? I think we need government for markets, right? We need the enforcement of contracts. We
We
need
do.
the fraud protection. And so, yes, it is a limited form of government, but I do think it's fair to say that if your choice, let's say you don't like the fact that companies are polluting, right? And that they're doing that because they're going to make more money if they do than if they don't, right? And so you have two choices. One is you give the CEO and the board this blank check that they're going to be able to basically set shareholder value on fire in the name of stakeholders, right? So that they'll hopefully do what you want them to do. Or we can say, you know what? We're going to send you to jail if you pollute. Now go ahead and keep trying to maximize shareholder value, right? And we're going to use that as our yardstick. I think the latter is going to give you much better results than to give them sort of a free, a blank check to do what they want in the name of stakeholder capitalism.
Well, again, I think you and I would differ on the. Again, this is if you want to define stakeholder capitalism the way the virtue signalers did, we violently agree. I vi Companies should not. In fact, one of the tenets of those of us who go way back with stakeholder capitalism is you don't get involved with social issues in any way unless they are directly related to the purpose, goals, and objectives of your organization. I don't see how recruiting different types of people is necessarily consistent with the purpose, goals, and objectives of the organization. So I think what happens, Stefan, is that here's the problem when the shareholder is your number one goal. When your shareholder is the number one goal, you actually make bad decisions. Because as you point out, look, like CSX Railroad, yeah, they're going to the shareholders in the short term are going to get more money if they successfully sell it, right? But it's still going to be a crappy company on the other end. So the shareholders get in, they get out. But so to me, Stefan, I agree with you. First off, we need to have laws, we need to have government. But how about changing the paradigm of leadership? You're a great organization. How about holding up companies that make money that, like for instance, all the companies we honor outperform the S&P 500. I think that's a pretty good benchmark, right? So if stakeholder capitalists, and the only difference between us and the traditional shareholder capitalists is that we put purpose number one. Purpose. Because if you define the purpose of, okay, I'm going to announce to all my employees and customers, why don't I get up on a stage? Why I've never heard one CEO ever run an ad. Hi, America. I'm president of Delta Airlines, and I want you all to know that the number one purpose of our organization is to make our shareholders richer. Now, I want you employees and you customers and all of you to work harder so that we can make the shareholders richer. Why doesn't anybody ever say that? Because nobody's motivated by that, Stefan. You want to motivate people, you motivate people on the purpose of the organization to make customers happy. If we make customers happy, the shareholders will be happy and we'll be happy because we have profit sharing. So my question to you is, there's no making the shareholder the North Star. Are you sure that's really better business? Are you sure? Because they don't create any value. The shareholder doesn't buy the product, it doesn't make the product, it doesn't distribute the product. The shareholder is a passive. I'm a happy shareholder. I've done very well over the last 3 years, but I didn't create the wealth.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy defending the shareholder primacy norm in terms of making shareholder wealth maximization the norm. And I do think it's not going to be utopian, but I think it's far better than any of the alternatives, right? I mean, I think the one of the things that's critical here is you're absolutely right about the messaging, right? So standing up and saying, hey, our purpose is to maximize shareholder value without doing a decent job of explaining the only way we get there. The only way we maximize shareholder value is by taking care of our customers, taking care of our employees, right? And oh, by the way, you employees should love this because we are using profit sharing, right? And you are owners in this company, so we are aligned. I do think it's easier on some level to get up and say we're going to save the world, right? On some level, it seems almost easier. But I do think that capitalism is worth defending because the road that you go down when you reject shareholder wealth maximization as your North Star and you start saying, we're going to pursue these other things, we're going to pursue purpose. Well, whose purpose? Who gets to decide the purpose? What if the CEO and the board decide their new purpose is we're going to basically bankrupt the business as long as we all get board seats at the World Economic Forum, right? These sort of agency costs that we talk about. So yeah, I am very comfortable defending shareholder wealth maximization. I admit that it is a defense that needs to be made better. But I do think as long as we keep telling that story, I mean, I'll just tell you very sort of briefly in terms of my own background, because I do talk in terms of left and right. I mean, we at the Free Enterprise Project, the National Center, we are nonpartisan, right? We don't take our marching orders from either party, but I certainly talk in terms of conservatives and leftists. And I used to be a leftist, and I changed dramatically, a complete 180. And part of that is I came to understand more about communism. And so now a lot of what I hear, and I'm not alone in this by any stretch, under the label of stakeholder capitalism is simply greasing the skids towards socialism and communism, right? As opposed to we have owners, we have private property, the shareholders are the owners of the corporation, they get to get the residual interest, and all of that then drives efficiently taking care of the customers, taking care of the employees, taking care of the environment, because if you don't, you're going to get crushed in the market ultimately. And yes, there need to be appropriate regulations as well. So yes, I am very comfortable defending the shareholder wealth maximization norm.
Well, so am I. And I frankly think, in fact, I love shareholder capitalists because to your point, they're ripe for the picking. Any company that focuses on short-term gains at the expense of long term, to me, is right. Look at the two most successful airlines in the United States. Both of them, Delta Airlines is a stakeholder capitalist company. They've made more money than anybody. And Southwest Airlines used to be, and they made more money than anybody, and then they lost their way because you cannot, see, I would argue that you cannot maximize shareholder value without maximizing the value that you create. And you cannot
Well, I think
maximize.
so. If
Go
I could
ahead,
just interject for a second, so
please.
there's a couple of things here. So one is, we love capitalism because we love competition, and we think competition, right? Iron
Yeah,
sharpens iron. That's the way we ultimately, get the tip of the spear out there as far
I
as
agree.
possible for all our benefits, right? So the
Yeah,
fact that corporations in a competitive landscape make bad decisions is just part of that competition. So
I agree.
company A, right, thinks that they're going to go there through cost cutting, and company B says we're going to invest in XYZ, and but both are claiming to be pursuing shareholder value. The fact that one of them turns out badly is that's just capitalism at work. That's the
And I agree.
creative destruction. Here's the thing that I struggle with when I hear this argument about short-term share value maximization versus long-term is that, I mean, from a finance perspective, the time value of money is relevant, right? So there are, at least in finance, ways in which I compare, some expected outcome 2 years from now versus an
Yeah.
immediate outcome. And I say, how do I compare those in terms of their expected value overall? So really, the short-term value game it should essentially be eliminated if they're doing the sort of calculating part of this properly, right? If they're thinking about value in terms of incorporating the time value of money. Now, I agree that there are certain incentives that are built into our system, and we just had a conversation from President Trump around, do we really want quarterly earnings announcements, right?
Mhm.
That's somewhat arbitrary, and it really does focus the companies on more of a short term. And there's a reasonable argument why, hey, maybe if we did away with that, and certainly companies that go private, they'll often say the reason we're going private is so we can make more long-term investments, right? But that to me is not a problem with capitalism. The other piece of it that I would say is in terms of, we're not going to make the shareholders our number one priority, or we're not going to make the share return our number one priority. To me, that says we are going to set shareholder money on fire in order to do something else. Because if you're not setting shareholder money on fire, then you don't need to qualify the definition, right? So, again, going back to why I oppose stakeholder capitalism as much as I do, it's because either it's all accruing to the benefit of shareholders, or you're setting shareholder money on fire. Like, which are you doing? And the one that gives you cover for setting shareholder money on fire is stakeholder capitalism, because you get to say, oh, well, yeah, this quarter we set some shareholder value on fire, but we did it because we're going to save some trees, right? So this is the sort of tension that I have, why I think we just need to
But that's not
defend
stakeholder
capitalism.
capitalism.
Well, no,
That's
I hear
virtue
you.
signaling.
I
Right?
hear
So
you.
let's be clear. I
I
agree with you. Anyone who
yes.
does that, that's not capitalism. That's
Right, but you're out on a
virtue.
limb saying, by defining stakeholder capitalism so narrowly. So you're saying, on the one hand, I'm going to reject capitalism, just plain capitalism, and I'm going to reject all the most popular versions of stakeholder capitalism, and I'm going to insist on this
But those
very
don't even
narrow
exist.
definition of stakeholder capitalism. Right? That's not going to get very far practically, because you're going to
Well,
you're,
that's
you're
what, listen, that's what your guys at the Heritage Foundation said. And here's
yeah.
what I'm going to say. All of this is based on a definition of capitalism that doesn't exist in anywhere in the literature. I have read 100 different studies. None of you guys have read any of them. None of you guys clearly have ever read any of it because nobody talks about these things before 1969, 2019. Nobody talks about it. They talk about how are we going to make money? Are we going to create money by taking money from people and hoping they're fooled? Are we going to take money by extracting all of the minerals and then leaving the community with a big pile of a legacy crap? Are we going to make money by fooling people? Are we going to make money by having 80% turnover because we pay people so?
So you're saying those were the common debates in the boardrooms up until 2019? Is
No,
that
they
they were
just
sitting
no.
around going, "Are we gonna like defraud people to make
No, they
money,
just
or are
did
we
it.
gonna?"
No, they just do it. They just
Well, I mean, so
look at advertising.
some portion of them are going to do it regardless because that's just human nature, right?
Right.
We live in a fallen world and we are fallen, and that's just the way it is. But the question is, are we going to make things better by giving more cover to the bad actors by saying we're not going to give you this bright line yardstick. Rather, we're going to allow you to do a bunch of different things under the guise of stakeholderism, right? And then we're just going to trust you, as opposed to no, the yardstick is shareholder value. And if you get it wrong, then you're either going to go to jail or you're going to get sued or you're going to go bankrupt. And we're going to leave
And
it
by the
alone
way,
at
I
that.
agree with you. I agree. You're right. Because I know that companies run this way do better. They do better. Look at history. Almost all of the shareholder capitalists are all gone. Sunbeam, what was that guy, Jack Welch, that famous guy? What happened to him and his companies? What happened to Chainsaw Al of Sunbeam? These people, they come and go. And by the way, I love shareholder capitalism. It's legal as long as you do it, and it's legal. Go to town because you are ripe for picking. And what we're doing as an organization, by the way, we don't believe in any government regulation any more than if the public wants government regulation, let them go for it. That's stakeholder capitalists don't need it because we don't need to be regulated because we are going to adhere to standards that we don't have
If
to hide about. Stefan, if I have to hide
if
about
that is
something,
your pitch, if your pitch is stakeholder capitalism will remove the need for regulation because we're all going to
no,
suddenly
no,
become angels,
no,
I don't
no,
think that's a
no.
very effective pitch.
That not saying that. But oh, by the way, because you remind me of Alexis de Tocqueville, when and that's a compliment, of course. When he came to the United States in the 1840s, he said, "Man's love of government is in direct proportion to his distrust of his fellow man." So yes, indeed, we need lots of government because we all distrust our fellow man. And all we are doing, and the reason we use the term capitalism in stakeholder capitalism is that we are capitalists. We believe in free enterprise. We believe in staying out of politics. We believe in focusing on value creation. And our only moral obligation is not to offload our costs onto society. It's not to throw liabilities under the local town, to throw liabilities under the federal government, and let's segue to a really fun subject to wrap up. And two things I think we may actually ironically agree on because Stefan, I think in a funny way, we might agree more than you do than you think because everything you're saying about stakeholder capitalism isn't my definition of it. I believe we need to have government regulation. But let the people decide. As a businessman, that's not for me to decide. That's for the public to decide how much regulation they want. So all I'm doing is a business. You've heard of the total quality management movement, right? That transform
Mhm.
quality, and that's all we are. All we are is advocating that we apply the same principles of total quality management that transform manufacturing to the management of people, and that we develop better metrics for helping CEOs actually see how the way they're managing people affects their stock prices. If you look at that study I sent you from Irrational Capital, companies that have highly engaged companies and employees do better over 6 years. And I think that's what you're talking about. If you do better than the S&P 500 for 6 years in a row, is that a measure of effective management?
Absolutely. And I will say I completely agree with you that anything that we can definitively support in terms of its ultimate outperformance, if you will, of the market in terms of profit and share value, uh, I'm going to get behind, right? And so I'm still going to be hesitant to call it stakeholder capitalism, not because I disagree with that particular application, but because I see what is being done in the name of stakeholder capitalism, and I don't want to give that any fuel, right? But in terms of the specific, hey, we have these studies, we have this evidence, we should be looking at this particular metric, we should be applying this metric more. You will have my support for that.
Well, and by the way, I'm going to argue with you, or not argue because this is a pleasant discussion, and I thankfully very much enjoy your point of view because I agree with much more than you think. Is that the fact of the matter is people simply aren't aware. It's not taught in business schools. So all we are doing as an organization, Stefan, is trying to educate the public that there is another way to manage a business. It's called total quality management for people. And the reason we call it capitalism is because it's a free enterprise. And the only reason we don't call it shareholder capitalism is that that total quality management is not designed to make it will make the shareholders happier. Because look what happened to the American manufacturing market by the Japanese. They destroy, everybody's forgetting that what they did to our market is permanent. It wasn't temporary. They permanently dislodged American manufacturing from being a primary manufacturer in the US by implementing better management. So the reason we called stakeholder management, they had to come up with a name for total quality management. They couldn't call it the same thing because the same thing wasn't working. So they came up with a new approach. And all it means, Stefan, is it's a holistic, systematic approach that really understands where value is being created and has nothing to do with this nonsense that I completely agree with. I think the BRT, I I have not seen one press release about stakeholder capitalism that I think is real. But tell me, before we move to this last issue, who are the people that are using stakeholder capitalism to promote communism? Please name one organization that is using that term to promote. Where is this you're telling me that I'm on the slippery slope to communism? Stefan, I've devoted my whole life to
I
this.
will tell you that I think that I'm happily going to point at a number of leftist organizations that promote stakeholder capitalism as a way to undermine capitalism, with the end goal being undermining capitalism so that we replace it with socialism slash communism.
Well,
Right.
tell
So
me about
I
them.
don't.
I'll expose them. Who
I
are
don't
they?
think there's any. I don't think there's any problem with that, right? You just sort of you put the dominoes together. So
But
I mean,
who
I
are they?
basically
Tell
I
me.
would
Who
argue
is? Name one.
Sure, I would argue that some of the union pension funds that are lobbying for climate, the Green New Deal, right? To me, the Green New Deal is basically a slippery slope to socialism slash then communism, right?
That's not
To
stakeholder capital. It has nothing to do with stakeholder capital. What
Okay,
about
but
the
I mean
dog?
that's great, but I can tell you they are using the language of stakeholderism, right? So the unions, the New York City comptroller, organizations like
I
As
agree.
You Sow, right? Like they're all using this veneer of stakeholderism. They believe they are truly promoting stakeholderism, and it is in fact. If you give them a choice right now, they get to flick a switch, socialism or capitalism. They're all picking socialism, right?
Well,
And then it's a quick downhill from there as far as I'm concerned. So I do think we can name names, we can identify parties, and that's the problem. You know, one thing I was thinking of when you were talking, where I could really see the way that you're talking about stakeholder capitalism and presenting it and defending it could really be effective is if you did go get more of a toehold in the business schools, because they are still all in, right, on the activist version of stakeholder
oh,
capitalism.
no, no,
And
no,
it
no,
and if you and
Stefan,
if you
no,
no,
no.
no, I'm saying they're in on the virtue signaling, greenwashing, ESG, like all of it, right? They're still pushing that. You're still having people come out of business school by the droves that don't think they need to do a net present value calculation or an ROI assessment, as long as they have some good purpose to save the world, right? As long as there's some being on the right side of history story that they can tell, they can just basically proceed because their conscience is going to be clean, right? So if you go into that environment and you say, yeah, let's talk about stakeholder capitalism, I'm all for it, but I think you might be defining it, let's say, just too broadly, right? So you don't
Well,
get
I
too much
love what you're
resistance from
saying
that,
because I'm
right?
going
I
to
mean, I
prove you
think that
right.
could be a winner.
No, I'm going to prove you right. Okay. And this is a segue to something you and I probably agree on also in a funny way. DEI. So DEI comes along, and the way stakeholder capitalists view DEI, look, I didn't start a business to solve racial problems in this country. I've started three small businesses. I never once thought in my mind that I was going to solve racial problems. If I had a good candidate who was black, Chinese, gay, whatever, I didn't care. If they're a good candidate, I'm going to hire, right? If you get along with blah, 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 blah. Then all this nonsense came along that somehow businesses have to redress all of the horrible things that happened. Well, gosh, the American Indians, I live right near where there was a beautiful, beautiful Indian village. How the heck you can still see the oyster shells that they ate? No joke. Um, I can't redress that. So let's discuss where DEI could let's be good. Okay, I agree. All these nonsense things that they did were pure virtue signaling. I didn't see one program that made sense. In fact, I could get myself sued if I told the truth about things I saw. And yes, Stefan, when I told the head of diversity at a major university on a YouTube show like this, that you've got to stop using this racial equity thing. It's not going to fly. Don't ask me as a white man to redress all of those causes. Yes, if you want to promote things that help disadvantaged Americans and poor Americans get an education based on their wealth or lack of wealth, great. But don't, once you get into this, well, she yelled at me and she said, no. I said, look, it's just better business. Let's fight it on our. How can anybody argue? If you have more black customers, you're richer. If you have more Chinese customers, if you have more gay customers, you're doing better off. Why do we have to get it into racial this or that? And she yelled at me so badly that the dean of the school, after, and by the way, I had to show up for 1 hour. Stuff on 500. I mean, a whole bunch of people jumped on it, and the dean called me and asked me to take it down. And this is of a major university. And I did. And I did. But so you're right. If you say to the left, in fact, you know who the biggest opponents of stakeholder capitalism are? The left. And that's why I'm disagreeing with you. The left hate it. I just did an article on it. 15 different left-wing people, why they hate. You know why they hate it? God forbid that shareholder capitalism could be good. God forbid that free enterprise could be good. So you are right, but the thing that you're getting wrong, there are a lot of left-wing people that hate it because they you know what they say? Oh, you're just trying to gild the lily. You're just trying to dress up the pig. So let's get to this issue, and I'll let you go. You've been very kind with your time. ESG. Pardon me. Let's go back to DEI. Is there a legitimate business strategy to make sure that you are making sure that you have the most talent you can get from any any industry from any community, because I'm going to give you a factual thing and I'm going to ask you to answer this. In the trucking industry, and I know this firsthand, they have an enormous labor shortage, huge. And until about 10 years ago, it was all white, all white. And somebody said, maybe if we hire some black people, we'll have an easier time hiring people. Well, some of the trucking companies didn't like it. And so one of these guys, and I hear this is firsthand from a major trucking company. This guy was a recruiter for a trucking company. He said, oh, we have these new rules that we have to get more black people in here. So here's what I want you to do. When you recruit black people, I want you to bring them to the white strip club to have lunch to recruit them. Why would I do that? He said, because if you bring them to a white strip club, they're not going to want to work here. So there were all of, now, is that good for capitalism? To deliberately not have black people working? To deliberately, and you're going to tell me that that didn't happen? So what is wrong with the DEI? I agree. All the virtue signaling, these stupid groups, it's all virtue signaling, but I've seen much more money wasted on other things, by the way. So what DEI would you accept?
So I think first of all, the behaviors that you just identified are likely illegal, right?
Yeah.
So I like to stick with our current anti-discrimination laws and just say discriminating on the basis of race is illegal, right? And if you're a capitalist, you have to obey the law. So if you are discriminating on basis of race, you are not a capitalist. Is
But wait a
basically
minute, but
how.
but wait a minute, aren't they violating their fiduciary responsibility?
No, this is basic corporate governance one-on-one. When we say maximize shareholder value, that is within the law. I'll give you a perfect example. If you get sued for breaching your fiduciary duties and you say, oh, I know I knowingly violated this law, this anti-discrimination law, but it was going to make more money, that's not a defense, right? Even in the most pro shareholder value state. So you're not allowed to break the law. So you have to do it within the law. So you maximize value. So everything you just talked about to me is just flat out illegal, and there's no justifying it. No capitalist, no true capitalist is gonna justify that. I think when you ask about is there a place for increasing diversity, let's say that, right?
Yeah.
I think you touched on it because there are metrics. So when we focus on race, it is so divisive and it is so neurotic because it ends up putting even the applicants that it is framed as helping, it puts them in situations where either they are set up to fail or they will have this marker on them that they're a quote unquote DEI hire as they go through their days at work. I mean, we have, again, Project 21, we have something like 50 plus Black conservative ambassadors, and I can tell you they all hate DEI, right? Because one, they don't think they need it. They believe that they actually are qualified to get the jobs, right? And they don't want the scarlet letter of being a DEI hire.
Yeah.
And they think it's essentially neurotic. When you tell people that every time you fail, it's because of the racist systemic system, they're never going to look internally to see how can I exercise my agency, right? So it's just neurotic from the top down, the way that it's been applied, sort of the critical theory roots. But if you want to say, hey, we want to expand the scope of our hiring, we want to have a more diverse workforce or just have more people to choose from, there are ways of doing that. You mentioned wealth, right? So let's look at hiring. What universities are you going to? What colleges are you going to? What high schools are you going to? What community colleges are you going to, right? And is that footprint, could that be broader? And could you expand it on the basis of economic status to catch people you normally might not? And then you don't have to lean into this divisive and likely illegal DEI agenda. So again, this is a place where each of those words, diversity, equity, and inclusion, are great words, right? I mean, A plus to whoever wanted to brand this neo-racist discrimination in the name of anti-discrimination. They did a great job because those words, if people are busy, which most people are, and they hear diversity, they think great. They hear equity, they think great. They think inclusion, they think great. What they don't realize is that we're talking about diversity by way of discriminating illegally. We're talking about equity in terms of equality of outcomes, regardless of merit. And we're talking about inclusion by exclusion, right? So we're going to include historically marginalized groups, and we're going to exclude everybody that we think was part of the problem. So we're going to have our hiring, and we've seen this for years, right? We're going to literally have our job postings say that if you're a straight white male who's not a veteran, you get points taken off, right? Because it's the exact same thing as adding points for being Black or being disabled or right? Like those are a wash. So you're literally putting out your job hiring saying we're going to take points off for you being a straight white male who's not a veteran. All of it is problematic from the ground up because it is rooted in essentially a form of neo-racism. And the problems that we're trying to address, the inequalities, which are real and we should be trying to address, can be addressed better by using things like geography, wealth, right, in order to increase the footprint from which we're drawing, both customers, employees, and so on. So I think there's clearly a place for it when it's properly applied. Unfortunately, again, as I would say with stakeholder capitalism, the whole acronym and the language has been so gotten such a bad rap, to put it simply, right? That we just need to talk in different ways. We need to get back to talking about class, and we need to talk about geography, and we need to talk about viewpoint diversity, right? These are the things that we can continue to advance the equality agenda, if you will, on.
So you wouldn't, and by the way, everything you say makes sense to me. So in other words, it would be fine. Let's say Costco, I'm making this up. Let's say they realize that, they require a regular flow of skilled workers for their stores and that they retire and and they don't want to have to hire people from 80 miles away. So they set up a school, a Costco school that is specifically designed for low income communities, not Black, not white, not Chinese, could be white. Could be there. I grew up in places where the white people were poorer than Black. My grandparents had a farm in Western Pennsylvania. The lowest on the totem pole was not Black people. So, poor white people are discriminated against massively in this country, as are older people. So, how about a view that says, to heck with it, we're just going to do it, as you said, on economic status, and we're going to do it on, we're going to get the kids and we're going to help them, and it's not based on race. It's based on I grew up in the richest town in the United States. We didn't need any help. Okay, I wasn't rich, but we didn't need any help. Is it wrong to help poor people in the order of giving them skills that I can hire them later on? Is that wrong?
So here's the thing I want to qualify, right? So if you're doing it as a form of charity, that's fine. Designate it as charity. If you're doing it to maximize shareholder wealth and as far as your investments in the business, then justify it properly. And how do you justify it properly? I think you have to start with basic finance, right? Net present value calculations, ROI assessments. Do you have to limit what you do to those things? No, but you need to be honest
Yeah.
and say, we're not doing that present value. We're not doing ROI. Here's why, but we think we still have a rational business case, right? So it's win win. And that I think is a story that you can tell and should tell. And as long as those things are in place, so you're either doing it as a charitable, properly defined charity, or you're doing it because it's good for the business and win win for the community, right? Yeah, I can totally get behind that. And you're not discriminating on the basis of protected categories, right? That all lines up as far as I'm concerned. And I'll tell you really quickly. So, two things that I've been focusing on. One is I mentioned at the beginning that we do shareholder proposals. Well, one of the proposals that we're floating at a number of companies is we're specifically asking the companies to either issue a report or establish a committee that is focused on answering the question of whether and to what extent sustainability, ESG, DEI initiatives have been authorized and maintained on the basis of net present value and ROI calculations, right? Because I can tell you based on my experience talking to the folks making these decisions, it hasn't been, and they haven't even tried. And I think that has the potential to be an earthquake in corporate governance when that becomes clear to the market that this whole story of it's good for business, and we know it's good for business, and the fact that they haven't even tried to assess that the way you would do any other capital outlay, I think that's going to be quite a shock. And again, it doesn't mean that you don't do things that you can't justify on the basis of those financial calculations, but you should be honest about that, right? So that's point one. The other is I've become very interested in, and for myself, this was driven by the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I've become very interested in finding bipartisan solutions, right? We're nonpartisan, but it's just good language, it's easy language, right? I want to reach across the aisle. I want to do things with people that disagree with me on 9 out of 10, right? And I don't care that we disagree on 9 out of 10. So, for example, we filed a child labor proposal at Tesla, right? Which I wanted to mention. I think Tesla was a great example with Elon Musk's salary, where that might have been one of the best defenses of just pure shareholder wealth maximization capitalism ever. Because basically the proposition was, if I do XYZ, if I make everyone better off, customers, drivers, right, employees, then I'm going to get paid. I'm going to get the big bag. And that won, right? And I think that was a really effective defense, maybe one of the best we've had in a while. But we did a child labor proposal, and that's a proposal I think it would be difficult for a leftist activist to say we're not going to get on board with the child labor, to make sure that is being limited to the absolute minimum, right? If not completely eliminated. So those sorts of initiatives, and as you mentioned, like, hey, let's figure out a way to uplift, right? To raise the floor. It can be education, it can be wealth, it can be health, but not on the basis of race, right? Just lift the floor for everybody. You
Yep.
will naturally raise the floor more for communities that are disproportionately impacted, right? But you're not dividing all of us on these sort of essential, neo-racist, neo-sexist metrics. Yeah, I am all for that, and always looking for ways to do more of that.
Yeah, well, listen, the one thing, children are born innocent into this world. Once we're formed as adults, it's very difficult to change things, but our little children are innocent, and to me, they deserve equality amongst and to me, it isn't an issue of black or white. There are many wealthier black communities around me than I am. Okay, they don't need any help either. Okay, they're doing just fine. But poor people all over this nation, white, black, old, whatever. So let me ask you about, I think there's one little question I have about this. You're opening up a can of worms. And I love that. I'm going to write about this. I love it. You're opening up a massive can of worms with your approach to ESG. Because do you know that business, and why don't you consider a shareholder action on this? And I'll be there with you. Okay, companies, tell me the net present value and future value creation calculations you're doing for the way you manage your people, you're going to get a complete zero. Wait a minute. 50% of your cash flow is paying for your employees. You said to me that that the employees are your number one asset, and yet you're telling me you cannot measure in any way what your investment employees is yielding in future value creation.
I love it. Let's do it. I mean,
Okay.
yeah,
Then
I'm
let's
on
get
board.
on. After this, let's talk because we're involved in it. And by the way, we are nonpartisan. And I'm going to say right now, folks, I agree with 90% of what this man has said. I think the only thing I disagree with is that he got caught up in all of the people in the Heritage Foundation community, got caught up with an imaginary, what I call really a straw man definition. But other than that, yeah, and the only other thing we disagree with, maybe Stefan, and you can maybe say I'm wrong, you disagree about more things, is that this notion that we should depend upon government all the time. I think I'm really a believer that we should try to change human behavior and try to, just like you're trying to change human behavior about DEI, and we should try to convince CEOs that, you know what, you'll make more money. You'll make more money if you don't rip off customers, if you don't lie to them in advertising, if you don't shortchange them with customer service. And look at these companies that are making more money than you because they're doing it right. That, to me, Stefan, is where the argument should be. I agree.
Yeah, I mean,
Show,
I am with you, and when I talk about the sort of outer bounds where limited government has a role to play in order to allow markets to function, the emphasis is on limited. Believe me, we are a free market think tank, right? So that's point one, and then beyond that, um, I think I just lost my train of thought. So maybe maybe it's time for that afternoon cup of coffee. But I'll leave it there. Yes, I agree with you on in terms of the government piece of it is very limited, but it does need to be there, and it is part of the conversation, right? And we're not basically just asking for people to just be better people, and so we won't need regulation. Fraud, anti-discrimination, environmental regulations. There is a place for that. That is part of the conversation about how to properly promote the capitalism that I think we agree on in great measure.
oh yeah, we listen, we're free. We are into free enterprise. And just, Milton Friedman has been so misunderstood. He was actually a stakeholder capitalist, and he admitted it later in life. And very few people know that because you know what he said that everybody forgets? He said, and you would agree with it. He said, and it's right in that New York Times article, I've practically memorized it. He said, the goal is to create maximize value for the shareholders as long as you act within the ethical and legal bounds of society, which everybody, Stefan, has emphasized throughout this conversation. And then number two, here's what he said. And he headed off virtue signaling by about 50 years. He said, and those of you companies might very wisely realize that it makes sense to make sure that your employees are well fed and well housed, and that they live in safe communities, and that their environment is clean. That all may make sense, but that's just better business, so you don't brag about it. So,
Nice. I
so
actually did just remember what I was going to say, the second
please.
thought that left my mind there for a minute, which is I think we are very much aligned on the free exchange of ideas, right? The battle for hearts and minds in the sense of making the better argument, right? Make the argument and let those ideas clash against each other and figure out what's best. And then also let there be a range of applications, and the
Yes.
competitive marketplace will raise some ships and sink some ships, and in the end I think there's a good reason to think we all end up better off.
And that's it. So one last, you've been so generous with your time, but so wouldn't the argument that you just made about DEI, which I frankly agree with personally, whether that matters or not, apply to the environment again? Um, is human beings the cause of global warming? We don't know. There've been global warming periods in history, right? There was the little ice age in Europe that caused the Great Plague, perhaps. So maybe this is all nature. We don't know. But we do know that when I put PCBs in the Hudson River, and I put 1 million gallons of theirs, right? And then I walk away, what am I doing to my future shareholders? So what if we look at ESG just in a practical sense that, hey, it's not ethical to offload your costs onto your communities. That's all. Forget about global. Okay, global warming, let everybody, the policymakers, but I'm running a company. it would never make sense for me to take all my garbage and throw it out in the backyard. Shouldn't we fight the ESG thing really on risk mitigation? Forget about even the moral thing. You are damaging your shareholders if you are offloading your costs onto society because you are creating a risk for future shareholders, aren't you?
I mean, I think those are all arguments that should be being considered. Such a big part of this, as far as I'm concerned, is there's a duty to make business decisions on a fully informed basis, right? A fiduciary duty. And I think one of our concerns is that too many decisions have been made in essentially an echo chamber, right? I mean, that's how you get these blowups like we've had, like with Cracker Barrel and Bud Light and others, where it just seems like everybody sitting around the room is like, yeah, what could possibly go wrong? And then they just don't even have anybody at the table to raise their hand, or at least be willing to raise their hand. So I think that the arguments that you're making definitely should be part of the conversation. I think I'm probably a little more of a harsh capitalist in the sense that I do want my managers to push for every cent, right? But I qualify that by saying we take into account the time value of money, and we can account the reputational risk, right? And we do recognize that if we turn off all our customers, even if we save 10 cents, right? That's a problem. So I think you can work all those arguments into a frame that is still ultimately grounded in maximizing shareholder value. And it's about making sure that all the information is there. And that's really the focus of those proposals that I just mentioned, where we're asking, has anybody in the room even been asking about these sort of basic, it's almost finance 101, management 101. Are you even asking these questions when you're doing these initiatives? It's not that the initiatives are necessarily wrong or bad, or not even ones that I would, or even ones that I might support, but are they properly informed, or are they just running off of again, this like echo chamber fuel?
Well, I'm going to say one last thing. I'm going to give you the last word. But look, one of the things we've learned over the last 10 years is that CEOs are very publicity conscious 20 years ago, right? So we saw, I agree with everything. We got all this whitewashing after the 2008 thing, right? And then obviously George Floyd caused a lot of that. And then the ESG thing caused a lot of that. Then our President Trump comes along and all of a sudden our CEOs are all of a sudden bowing to him. Like whoever the thing du jour, fad du jour is, the CEOs just seem to go along. Because when it comes to people, I don't think they run businesses in a strategic and systematic way, the way they run their manufacturing, they run laboratories or mergers and acquisitions. I think when it comes to people, companies like just like Cracker Barrel, Anheuser-Busch, so many others, they just come up with things that make no sense because they're just trying to make everybody happy. And so and that to me is, and now by the way, I'm a free enterprise guy, and all of a sudden see the U.S. government investing in all these U.S. companies. What? And yet, meanwhile, people who call themselves conservatives, and I told you I'm conservative in some ways and liberal in others, I don't understand that. I don't understand so I think that at the end of the day, ideology is a bad thing, and that we really have to focus on, you know what? Future equity value creation. On that we agree, Stefan. So
Mm-hmm.
I would say that you and I probably agree a lot more than we would think on the overall way business should be run, but your argument is that the stakeholder capitalism term, frankly, has been polluted too badly that even if it's in that, frankly, what I am advocating probably for you is simply better capitalism, right? And that by calling it stakeholder capitalism, you are contributing to confusion. Would that be your position?
I think that's very fair. Yes.
And my position would be, but I promise you the last word, so I'm going to still give it to you, that the shareholder capitalist, that has been destroyed. The younger generation doesn't like it anymore. The younger generation is moving to socialism. The younger generation is moving to democratic socialism, and that the shareholder capitalism brand was destroyed by that guy Gecko in the 1990s. So my argument would be the same as yours. Your brand is tarnished and mine is cleaner because the only people who messed it up were the people who invented it, who invented pardon me, this definition. But anyway, Stefan, you have the last word. What is the hope for capitalism?
Well, so first of all, I think a lot of what we do in these conversations and in what I do every day and we do society wide is ultimately about predicting the future, right? I mean, yes, we have fights about what the current facts are and what the history was, but in the end, we're having those fights because we're promoting a point of view that we think is going to lead to better outcomes in the future. And so, of course, none of us are perfect at predicting the future. So when you say, as you do, that, hey, I think there's a similar problem with just capitalism and shareholder wealth maximization as I claim there is with stakeholder capitalism, I think that absolutely could be the case, right? And we're seeing certainly red flags to that extent. Now, my response to that is simply to tell the story better and more effectively, and so on. But time will tell. Time will tell. I will say that I think in terms of if this was in part your question, where are we going? Where is the hope? I do actually think that there might be some really earth shattering or earth shifting things coming out of AI, right? And especially when you're talking as you are about, hey, what about some new metrics? What about some metrics that measure outcomes where we aren't paying enough attention? Like you say, employees and how we're, treating our employees. And I think that that's a place where I want to be optimistic. I'm going to be optimistic that with all the pros and cons that we talk about with AI, that it may well allow us to have better information processing and information gathering and allow us to do capitalism better because the inputs will be more informed.
You are absolutely right. And the reason I am very, very confident in the principles of stakeholder capitalism, whatever you call it, enhancing returns for investors, that's our definition, enhancing returns for, in fact, we'll even say in optimizing returns for investors only by creating value for your stakeholders. But anyway, Stefan, this is terrific. We're going to have a great feature article about this. I'd like you to hang on for one more moment to thank you and share what we're going to do with this. And a great discussion, and I really appreciate your time and candor.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it as well.
Thanks.